Great, thanks very much. Thanks, Louise, and thanks, Chrissy and other colleagues at the State Library for getting me here. Also, thanks to my colleagues on the Australian Generations Project for all the work they've done, but also for helping me develop some of the slides and a lot of the ideas in this talk. I was an army kid, so I spent a few years as a young boy in Townsville and Cairns, so it's nice to come north again, if not far north. It's a long time since I've been to Townsville. In fact, last time I was in Townsville was when our house got blown down in Cyclone Althea and we got evacuated in an Army Hercules to Brisbane. And that's my last memory of Townsville. Let me start by letting some of our interviewees tell you about why they wanted to record their life stories for the Australian Generations Oral History Project and what they got out of it.
I think I would like actually to begin by asking you why you decided to do this interview.
I obtained the information through the Heritage Committee of the local Narracoorte Westendale Council, as I'm part of that committee, and history is one of my great loves. And so I thought, well, if nobody puts their hand up for this, you know, nothing's going to be recorded. And I just thought it would be an interesting thing to do.
And was it something about your own life that prompted you?
Oh, look, I've done lots of things. I suppose my understanding is that we will receive a copy of this recording. Am I correct? Yes, I suppose I am. And I think the good thing for me is that it will record things that maybe I've never spoken to my children about that I had not realised. They'll have the recording. The other thing that really interests me about recording is my parents are both dead. I have no recording of their voices, and so as my voice is to aged care, so I speak quite loudly, they'll at least have the sound, and that's something I really miss.
Why did you agree to be part of this project?
Well, I heard the program on the ABC radio and I thought it was quite an interesting program. I think so much has happened in our country and capturing some of different views would be quite interesting for the future generations to work through and have a listen to.
So where would we start with your story, with your life story? Where would we begin?
Probably back in my home suburb, and I guess where I see my first generation in Paraffel Gardens in Adelaide.
It'll be interesting to see how it turns out. I don't think I'll sit down and listen to a whole lot of it.
No.
Oh, bit long. You need to abbreviate it a bit. Yeah. But when I originally heard the article on the ABC radio, I thought it was a great thing, and I thought, am I in the category that they just want, and I thought I was a pretty ordinary person, so that might be good to balance out some of the extraordinary stories. Yeah.
So in this talk, I don't want to talk about the content of the interview so much, but really about the approaches and the issues that we've been dealing with in creating a national oral history project. It's a national project, but I think much of what we've been doing is relevant to you, whether you're working at a local level or a regional or even a state project. Let me start and tell you a little about the origins and aims of the Australian Generations Oral History Project. It's a project that's funded by the Australian Research Council under what's called their linkage grant scheme, which is, it links university academics like me with people working in industries, including, well, in this case, historians from Monash and La Trobe universities in Melbourne, with Kevin Bradley and the team of oral historians at the National Library, and Michelle Rayner and a team of social historians at ABC Radio National. So they were the partner organisations for the project. And our objective was to produce 300 life history interviews, averaging about 5 hours each, with people from all over Australia, but to actually do about 50 interviews from people born in each decade from the 1930s through to the 1980s, with a sprinkling of older folk in the 1920s. But cutting off at 1989, which is when my daughter was born, given that when we started the project, after that people would be 18 or younger, and the ethics clearance for that was just not worth it. So it's people in their 20s upwards. Unlike a lot of oral history projects, which tend to focus on older people, trying to capture stories while they're still available, we just wanted to record people's lives of the 20th and 21st century, but also of different generations or cohorts of Australians. So one of the objects of the project was to create an online digital archive of about 1,500 hours of interviews with a wide range of Australians. And the aim for us in the first instance as a research team, and there's National Library, ABC, and then 7 historians, so there's 9 in the research team, would be to use those interviews in the first instance to explore change and continuity across 20th and into the 21st century in Australian lives, everyday lives. But also to explore, to track an issue across time like parenthood, how it was the difference between being a parent in the 1930s and the 1950s and 1980s, but also to track through one person's life and with one cohort how their experience of the generation born in the 1930s, how they experienced their life across time. We just thought this would pose all sorts of really interesting issues to explore in terms of Australian social history and people's experience. In terms of our outputs, the researchers, we're, as researchers do, creating a couple of books, an anthology, which I'll talk about later, and a theme issue of a journal. But we've also, because we're partnering with ABC, they're producing a series of radio programs, 4 of which have already gone to air, and an earlier series from a pilot project. In fact, the most recent one was last Sunday on Hindsight, ABC Radio National. It was about going away to school, which was really interesting because it was everything from going away to a private school as a boarder to going away to be institutionalised in care. So it was a really wide range of the experiences of young Australians moving out of whatever their home was to go away to school. It's an example of the sort of intimate lives and stories that this sort of material evokes, gives you access to. So 3 outputs, an archive, radio programs and writings, but probably most importantly for us in the project, creating an archive that would be available forever as a sort of legacy to future Australians. So in 200 years' time, people could use this set of interviews, if you like, as a snapshot of Australians recorded in the early 21st century talking about their lives through the 20th and 21st century. As a project, there were 2 models or exemplars that we learnt from when we were creating the project. One was a British project called The Century Speaks, which was an oral history project for the millennium, coordinated by the British Library in partnership with BBC Radio, and they had interviewers in every BBC regional radio station across the country, recording interviews and then making programs for the millennium, and then created an archive, I hate to say it, 60,000 interviews. It's a huge, huge archive. So the collaboration between an archive and radio was what we learned from that project and managing a big project. But the other one was closer to home, and this was the Australia 1938 project. Some of you will remember during the bicentenary there was a national bicentennial history project where they decided to slice 50 years of Australian history and do a history of each 50-year slice, 1788, 1838, 1888, 1938. And the 1938 team decided that they would do something distinctive. It was the early days of oral history, and it was the late 70s when they were developing it, and they decided to do an oral history project about Australia in the 1930s and specifically 1938. And really pleased that Peter Spirit's here. Peter was together with Bill Gamage and Louise Douglas, were the founding 3 for that project, which conducted over 600 interviews with over 200 mostly volunteer interviewers. And I believe those interviews, they're all in the National Library, but I think the state collections are also in the respective state libraries. And they were doing a project before email, when STD phone calls were expensive, where you wrote letters to people, you were recording on cassette tapes, and there's a lovely correspondence from Peter saying, very soon now, voice recognition software will be ready so that we can transcribe our interviews without having to do anything. We'll just put it into a machine. And 40 years on, it still hasn't happened, Peter, and I'm not sure if it will in my lifetime either. So that was another really important project that we learned from, but also we learned things to do, but also things not to do, just because the way that technologies have changed, but also understandings about oral history and how to do it. So let me talk you through the project, outlining what we've done and some of the issues that we've been dealing with. And I'm speaking now in literally the last weeks. We're up to doing the last dozen or so interviews. We've pretty well finished selecting people for interview. and a large number of the interviews are now already available on the National Library website, one of which I'll play you in a moment. The first question people ask when we talk about the project is, how do you choose your interviewees? And it'll be the first question any of you will be asked when you set up an oral history project. Well, some people have described, I've heard it described as the Achilles heel of oral history, that you can only ever recruit and interview people who are willing. You can't force people to tell you their story, and that's fair enough. So you always got to know that you've only got the survivors, people who are alive to tell their story, and that's a selective sample in itself. And you've only got the willing, the people who feel confident and able and interested, but also they feel affirmed and recognised and encouraged by you to tell their story. And so how do we find these willing people? And more importantly, how do we go beyond the actively willing to the quieter Australians who needed to really be encouraged, if not cajoled, to tell their story? We did a lot of publicity initially through the ABC because that was a partner, and particularly ABC Regional Radio, but you'll know that that will only capture a certain demographic of Australians. So we spread more widely through Facebook and Twitter and a whole range of social media that was great at getting particularly younger folk. We did targeted publicity with Aboriginal and Indigenous communities, with migrant resource centres and so on and so forth. And what we did is we asked people in the first instance to express an interest in being interviewed for the project. And we asked them to send back, either doing it online, they could click a button and express an interest, or they could send something to us written, or they could email us something, or they could ring us up and actually scribe it on the phone if they didn't feel like and weren't able to write. And we asked them to give us some basic biographical details so we could make sure we got a range of people, but also just to write as little or as much as they wanted about themselves so that we had something to go with when we were deciding who to interview. And they range from just a few lines to several pages. And those expressions of interest are fascinating in themselves. We've received about 680 odd. With each of them we've asked for permission for it to be archived, and most people have said yes. So the archive that'll end up in the National Library will not just be the 1,500 hours of interview, it'll also be about the best part of 700 written life stories, some short, some very long, including from people that we haven't been able to interview. And they're fascinating. They're fascinating for the first way that someone decides to tell you their life. We didn't set it up in any way and say, tell us what we wanted them to say. We just say, tell us a little bit about your life in your own words, in as much detail as you want. And just to give you a range, I'm just going to show and read two of them that we received. And this one from a woman born in the 1950s. I was born in the early 50s, the first of 8 children. I grew up in Queensland, moving around every couple of years because we needed bigger houses or to be close to public transport and schools. I'm a hospital-trained registered nurse who specialised in operator theatre nursing over 40 years. I'm still registered but haven't worked for 2 years because of the decline in regional hospital services. My own family of 8 children have grown up and moved on to families and careers, and we're currently operating a sawmilling business here. My 12th birthday was the day John Kennedy died. I've grown through the Vietnam War, the end of it, and conscription, and all the permutations of politics since. I've been politically involved all my life. My father introduced me to political discussion and thought, and I've become an active participant ever since. I've brushed by some interesting people in the arts when I served on the board of council arts committees. I've hung art exhibitions, managed festival events, and seen lots of tourism ventures kick off and fail. I'm passionate about grassroots power and giving everyone democratic representation. So that's just one example of how one woman born in the 50s wrote. Here's another one, a shorter example. This is from a man born in the 1980s. I was born in Sudan, and the war started as a child. I have no recollection of how it did. Mother told me that she carried me on her back and we travelled by foot to a displacement camp in Ethiopia. My childhood was spent there. In 1991, war broke out again in Ethiopia, and we again flee and crossed over to Sudan border and into Kenya. I came to Australia in 2004. And with that one, that was all we had. That's just pictures of just a small selection of the 300 people that we've interviewed. And just a note in passing, we're not doing video interviews, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We're doing audio interviews, but we have decided we're taking photographs at every interview. One photograph just of a sort of headshot, but also one photograph where we ask the person to choose a place or an object or some way to be taken in a photograph with something that represents some aspect of their life, which is lovely to have because it gives you another layer of evidence. It reminds you of where we did the interview. It gives you a resource if you're doing things with this material that you can actually show people's faces while listening to their stories. So who does come forward and who has written expressions of interest, but also who hasn't, and how have we tried to reach the so-called quiet Australians? When we started, you'd have to say that we could have pretty well filled the 300 with educated, middle-aged women and men born in the 30s and 40s, and that would have filled the books in no time at all, partly because of the ABC demographics. So we realised pretty quickly, yes, that's an important set of stories, but we needed to reach more widely and try a range of different forms of publicity. And that's the challenge of a national project. A local project has a great advantage. As you're close to the ground, you can use very local media, very local radio, newspapers, word of mouth, posters up in sports halls and so on. You can really get to a wider range of people, much harder for a big national project. Interestingly, we found right at the end of the project, we got better and better and better at it, particularly through word of mouth, quite explicitly saying to people who'd been interviewed or in our publicity or on the website, we're looking for young men born in the 80s, or we're looking for people who haven't got higher education, or we're looking for post-war migrants and so on. And then people would suggest people would then express, and we broadened out. So we had to choose 300, and we've had best part of 700 people expressing an interest. How do we make that selection? Partly it's just hunch. It's partly you read these expressions of interest and think, I'd really like to hear more of that story. I think that's a fascinating story. It's covering aspects of Australian life and history that we think are valuable, perhaps not often recorded. Partly also there's an element of wariness and exclusion. As I said, we realised that there were certain categories that we filled very quickly. And so pretty much for the last year, women and men born in the 1930s and 40s with education, we just put them aside straight away because we've got a lot of people like that. But also exclusions in other ways. We've actually, interestingly, we've got a lot of historians or people working in museums and local history collections and libraries coming forward, and we put a stop on that pretty quickly as well, because we thought we can only get so many historians talking about their lives. But we also realised one of the other things that was interesting, we hadn't expected, but it's not surprising, is that we got advocates coming forward, particularly people who are either suffering from or have family members or friends suffering from physical or mental health problems, who've got involved in advocacy organisations within which speaking autobiographically about your experience of polio or mental health or whatever has become a significant part of advocacy. And those people were coming forward to tell their stories to this project. We thought they were important, and actually probably the theme that comes through most clearly in a lot of these interviews is just how important significant mental health has been across the 20th and into the 20th century for people from all ages and all backgrounds. It's just huge in these stories. And that's something about the time of the telling. This is a time when people can tell these stories that possibly they couldn't so easily in the 70s and early 80s. But we did decide after a while we would draw a bit of a limit on advocates. We didn't want people to use the project for advocacy. We wanted people's life stories. So that was another why we were being careful. We also got a bit careful with where we thought an interview would be either risky for the person telling their story or for the interviewer. Some people with really, what sounded, as best you can tell from the expression of interest, with really severe and current, for example, mental health issues or whatever. We just thought we can't risk that. So there were complicated decisions to be made. We also did it by demographics, and basically we used the demographics of who was applying to be interviewed and then who we'd interviewed to try and get not a representative sample, because you can never do that, but as diverse a sample as possible of the range of people who've lived in Australia across the last best part of a century. And we were aided for this, you don't need to look at the detail, but we created a big spreadsheet where everyone expressed an interest went in, and it recorded where they were, where they grew up, when they were born, gender, occupation, education, so on and so forth. And then we turned that into little tables that gave us a sense of where we were at, just so that we could realise that we didn't have many young men born in the 1980s, or we were really light on post-war migrants and so on, and so could really look harder or select to improve the diversity. So let me just show you. I'm just going to show you to give you a sense of who we've got. And this is pretty close to the end product because we've accepted 302, I think, and we're not accepting any more. Just to give you a sense of the ways in which we've tried to select for diversity. So one is in terms of birth decade by gender, trying to get roughly comparable proportions of men and women across the decades. With obviously a lot more women than men coming forward. Not surprising. Oral history projects and history projects generally, women are often more willing and keen to tell their stories. We tried to match if you like, the regional map of Australia between people living in metropolitan, remote and regional areas. So we tried to balance that as well as best we can. So the column on the left is the expressions of interest received, and the one on the right is the people we've accepted. We've tried to match state distribution more or less to population. Victoria, we would have been way up because the project was based in Victoria, so we've sort of selected more in the other states to even that out. Important though to note that this is place of interview, not place of origin. One of the things you realise in a project like this is just how mobile, physically mobile, people have been, both from overseas but also across Australia. So state of interview is not necessarily state of origin, to use a controversial phrase. I still don't know which side I support, you know, having lived in both states.
It has to be Queensland. You're here.
I'm here, okay, today I'm... No, well, you're not exactly the underdog. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, we've had an interviewer in Cairns, an interviewer in Broome, an interviewer in Darwin, and doing targeted publicity to encourage people to come forward, and so I've interviewed most of the people who've expressed an interest. Place of birth, we know that not much less than a third of the Australian population were born overseas. So we wanted to register that. Australian stories include the stories of people who came from overseas, but also their lives before they came to Australia, because they bring all of that with them, and that becomes part of our history as well. So just under a third of the people we've interviewed were born overseas. From a wide range of countries, you can see down the bottom there, more often countries where people are more likely to be confident with English. So we did have some funds to do interviews in other languages, and we chose the languages mainly by where we could find an experienced interviewer. So the languages were Sudanese, Dinka, and Italian and Russian. They were the ones where we got interviewers. So we've got some interviews in other languages, and those ones are being both transcribed and translated. But interestingly, the hardest thing for us to get was that immediate post-war migration generation, Greeks, Italians, and so on and so forth. In a way, it's not they're not absent, they're certainly there. A lot of other oral history projects have captured that, and we've certainly got a lot of their children, second and third generation, that we've recorded. And this is one of the contrasts, I guess, with the Australia 1938 project, where, because it wasn't a project about Australia in 1988, it was about a project of Australia in 1938, and so you really didn't interview many people who were post-war migrants. It's people who remembered being in Australia in the 1930s. Social class is one of the hardest things both to judge and to measure and to match. And for us, our crude way of thinking about that was just in terms of higher education. It's pretty crude, but so we were looking at who had and didn't have higher education, and certainly in the second half of the project have really been pushing hard to get people who haven't gone, particularly from earlier generations, haven't had higher education, so that we get a broader diversity in terms of social class. But of course that's also confused by social mobility. A large proportion, particularly women born in the 30s, 40s and 50s, who would have come from working class backgrounds, but because of free higher education in the 70s and 80s actually were socially mobile. In fact, the phrase that resonates from one of our early interviews where a woman just said, "Gough Whitlam changed my life." And there's a whole mini project in using the material about that generation of women whose lives were changed by free higher education. It's also a contentious thing to say at this moment. And then sexuality. We also wanted to get a range of different sexualities and sexual life histories, and that's what we've done there. And interesting, again, compared to the Australia 1938, Peter might disagree, but I've listened to about a third of the Australia 1938 interviews, and I still haven't heard one where someone came out and as being gay. So in the late 70s and early 80s, either they weren't looking or people just weren't comfortable in telling those stories, whereas now people are comfortable and we are looking.
We occasionally had our suspicions, but they didn't like to press it.
You didn't like to press it, they didn't feel comfortable to share it. So really important. Sometimes you have to search hard for the stories for the people who might feel like it's not part of, it's not what you want. But it's the nature of oral history, it's never a representative sample. What you've got to try and do, I think, if you're trying to create an archive for future use, is to create diversity, get a wide range of experience as best you can. And then secondly, what you've got to do is know who and what you've got and what you haven't got and how, and you've got to let future users, historians, know that so that they can judge, okay, this is a project that is missing gay and lesbian Australians and therefore we need to take that into account. So you try and get diversity, but then you, when you finish a project, say, who and what have I got? And what do future users need to know about this project so that they can take that into account? And that's true for oral history. It's true of any archive sources. Who and what have you got? Who told stories that were recorded and saved and ended up in archives? That's never a representative sample either. So what about our interviewers? Very diverse also in terms of age, background, all over Australia. 29 people interviewed for the project, the 9 core members of the research team, and another 20 people that we employed. And one of the decisions we made, partly from me listening to the Australia 1938 project, where they never had the money to pay interviewers, they recruited and tried to train volunteers, and I've listened to them. There are some wonderful interviews in that archive, but there are also some really terrible ones with people who just didn't do the training or didn't learn anything and didn't know how to listen and interrupted and told their own story, etc. So we decided for this project, we did want to employ experienced professional oral historians, because it's not, anyone can do oral history, but not everyone can do it well. And actually to do it well, there's a lot of things to learn to do it really well. So we just, and actually we didn't just take it for read, because we advertised through oral history networks around the country for interviewers, got a lot of applications, and we asked them to send a CV, but also a recording of an interview that they'd done, and we listened to them all. And we didn't go on reputation, we listened to it in terms of, well, actually, we think this is a person who's good at listening, at encouraging someone to tell their story. And we chose. Now, not everyone turned out to be great, but most of them are pretty good, and I think that's made a big difference. And as you can see, a wide age range all over the country, with a diversity of experience as oral historians. Some people who'd worked for archives, in community history projects, some people who'd worked for radio, and we soon realised that there were different traditions or styles of interviewing depending on where people had come from, particularly the radio historians. And I'll come back and talk about that in terms of our outputs. Oh, actually, I'll just go back one, sorry. So the interviews themselves, we decided we were going to do life history interviews, which is really tell me the story of your life, and then sit there with someone encouraging, facilitating, drawing things out. Typically about 5 hours long, some shorter, some a bit longer, but that was what we budgeted for in terms of costs and average. And we decided that 5 hours you could get some real depth from a life story in 5 hours. You could also develop the sort of trust where people will go beyond the sort of superficial rehearsed stories. Life history, but not topic-based. A lot of oral history projects are topic-based, local history, women's work, whatever. We wanted them to be as broad and useful as possible to a wide range of future users, so we didn't want to just narrow them down. By the same token, we did want to actually have rich information on a range of topics, so we did a bit of a brainstorm of the sort of topics that we think future historians might be interested in, like faith and belief, or place and belonging, or technologies. And we worked up some guidance sheets for the interviewers on those, and we just said, look, if you're doing an interview and this life story is really rich about faith, belief, spirituality of whatever kind, take your time, drill down, think about the question sheet that we've prepared, and spend an hour or two talking about faith and belief, or the meaning of place, or moving from another country, or whatever, so that you get not only the span of a person's life, but some real depth about the topics that are really significant in their life, but also are going to be of great interest and value to historians now and in the future. Difficult, challenging for the interviewers to combine life history and theme, and with life history being the sort of primary thing. And our early discussions were about managing the interview in that sort of way. As well as the life history, we had a section at the end of concluding reflections where we asked people to reflect upon, as they look back on their life, the important things, to think a bit about their own generation and their cohort and what was distinctive, if anything, about that, but also to reflect about being interviewed. What it had been like to remember their life, to share it with someone else. Very valuable material for the project and for future users to get that. And a really great way of finishing an interview, just to ask someone about their experience of being interviewed. as I mentioned before, we decided to do audio interviews, not video, partly because our partners were the National Library, which mostly does audio, and ABC Radio, which works with audio. So it was almost by definition. I'm a great fan of audio. A lot of people are fans of video because you get all of those non-verbal and physical clues when people are telling their lives, their face, their body language. On the other hand, with audio, actually it forces you to listen and to really hear, whereas when you see a person talking, you often look at them and you don't listen as carefully. But we did it because of what we were producing with it, so really the choice is more about what you want to do. And we also decided, average 5-hour interviews, that we do it in 2 sessions. You can't do 5 hours in one go. You'd be more exhausted than they would. So 2 separate sessions, roughly the same sort of time, maybe on consecutive days, maybe following week. Big logistical challenges of doing that in Outback Australia and managing the logistics of that, but a really good thing to do. The second session is often the richest session. It's where the relationship and the trust and the confidence is there. You already know something about the story. The night between, you can think about, okay, maybe we didn't cover this, but also they can think about, maybe I didn't talk about that. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And this example relates to another thing that really became clear in these life history interviews, is that life history interviews are very emotional. People talk about all the stuff that's happened in their lives. They're very powerful. And the emotion can happen at any point. It's not like doing an interview with a war veteran where you know you're going to get some gutty, difficult stuff and you're prepared for it. You've got no idea what stuff's going to come up when. So you've got to be prepared for it, and so do they. So let me just play an extract, from David Cooper, who I interviewed. And this was when I asked him at the end about the interview. And you get a sense of both the emotionality of the remembering and of the life history and what's going on for David when he was remembering and telling his story. Look, last question, David. I guess I'm interested in what's it been like for you telling your story and being interviewed?
It makes you think. It's been good. It made me. It was good having the day's gap, 2 days gap in between, because that first night, I just I didn't sleep that well that night because I kept thinking about things that I hadn't thought about, and then it made me realise no, it wasn't the whole 5 years that I was at high school that I hated it. It was only the last 3 years, and so it made me think more deeply about things. So in some ways it's sort of like a bit of a counselling session too, and you verbalise something and it can put things back into perspective. So it's been good. It's been good from that point of view. So I've actually enjoyed it. Of course everyone worries that they've said the wrong thing or they made themselves look like an idiot, but I'm a bit past that now. If people think I'm an idiot, they think I'm an idiot. So it's been good. I'm glad I've done it, and the next stage will be interesting to see where my wife and kids, because there'll be things I would have told you that I've never said to them. So that'll be interesting to see their reactions, and that'll be really interesting to see their reactions.
I love that interview. Oral history is definitely not counselling, but there are overlaps. People are telling stories that are significant and powerful and sometimes poignant and painful, and you're sitting there encouraging and supporting them to tell it. It's often cathartic. 99 times out of 100 people are telling you the story because they really want to tell you, and they're getting a lot out of telling that story to an interested and affirming listener. But clearly it's work that needs to be done with sensitivity and care, and on the whole people take care for themselves, but you need to take care with them but also for yourself. One of the things that strikes us with life stories is that very often people start off with what you might describe as composed narratives, the rehearsed story, a sense of the story that they want to tell history and pass on to a younger generation. But one of the wonderful things that happens in an oral history interview is that the process of remembering and of having someone else that you're talking to triggers and extends those memories and takes people often into unexplored territory and depths. And that can be unsettling, but it can also be very rewarding, both for the interviewee and for the quality of the account. I'm just going to give you an example of this. This is from a discussion forum posting. We got our interviewers to post up their thoughts about each interview. I'm just going to read this because I love the way that Nicole talks about her interview with Russell Elliott, to give you a sense of the way in which his story changed through the course of telling it. I felt Russell would have been quite content to tell the story of his life from beginning to end without my intervention. When I did ask questions, however, Russell's tone changed completely. His tendency was to speak in generalities, describing the overall impact and his broad impression of events. For instance, speaking about his time at high school and teachers' college, he repeatedly described it as a barren landscape, absolutely nothing outstanding. With prompting, we were able to move to the specificities of his experience, revealing anecdotes, which were much more telling than the initial broad evaluation. I was heartened that Russell seemed open to renegotiating his story and memories on the spot, especially considering we were discussing some clearly painful memories. It was as though in those short moments after I'd asked for further elaboration, I could hear him shift into a different part of memory. He began to depart from the script of his prepared life story, the one of his memoir, he'd written a memoir, and into spontaneous recall, pulling out some of those memories that weren't often revisited, and rethinking the meaning of events as we spoke. Although Russell had written his memoirs, I suspect that perhaps unlike many of the women I've interviewed, he'd not often spoken about many of these memories. The telling seemed raw, and I was moved to tears several times. It felt an honour to hear this story told by such a quiet, unassuming man. One of the other things you get a sense of from both the photos and Nicole's writing is actually the unusual experience of this intergenerational interviewing. Our interviewees range from people in their 20s to people in their 80s and early 90s, but likewise our interviewers range from people in their late 20s to people in their 70s. And fascinating in all sorts of ways, fascinating in the different ways that people of different ages remember and tell their life story. And this is, you can't generalise, but older people tend to have gone through a process of life review and have a clearer sense of what their story is. We were struck interviewing younger folk that often you could see them working it out, literally, for the first time sometimes, as they were telling. Younger people tended to have less reservations about what they could say, extraordinarily frank, the sort of generation of social media, just extraordinary what people will tell you that you don't expect. And the intergenerational dynamics are just fascinating. Younger people interviewing older people interviewing younger people, and the way in which the relationship in an interview always shapes the telling in subtle and sometimes significant ways. And when you get these big differences, sometimes it's really obvious. So let me just, from another interview, this is Kath, who interviewed Robert Greaves, and again in her forum posting, just writing about the relationship that they formed and what was going on. At the end of our interview, he lamented that he doesn't think humankind have long left on the planet. "I'm sorry about your generation," he informed me, "but you're the ones that are going to have to do the work." I got the sense here that there was some intergenerational dialogue at play. Throughout the interview, it seemed that Robert was talking to me with his teacher's hat on and bestowing his life lessons to me through the interview process. Although I wasn't aware of it at the time, the authority in this interview, I think, lay more with him than it did with me. As a teacher with a clear idea about what he wanted to talk about, Robert led the interview with confidence and charisma, and I held on to his every word with the keen admiration of a humbled student. I do wonder whether or not Robert might have framed his life story differently if the interviewer had been of an older man. All in all, though, it was a rich interview, and I really enjoyed the experience. The life history interviews posed issues for the interviewers as well as for the interviewees. As I mentioned before, in life history interviews, they're often very intimate and sometimes shocking. Revelations, loss of a child, loss of a parent, loss of a partner, a terrible accident, ill health, domestic violence. It happens. It happens in most people's lives, or everybody's lives, in different ways, and it comes through in these interviews, and we've welcomed people being honest and frank about the sharp edges of their lives. But it is a challenge if you're the interviewer. It was particularly a challenge for our younger, less experienced interviewers. We had a couple of PhD students who we appointed because they already had experience doing interviews, but they weren't as experienced as the rest of us. And on reflection for them in particular, I think we underestimated the challenges and overestimated their experience in dealing with these intimate, sometimes often unexpected and sometimes quite challenging things. Most of the professional interviewers took it in their stride. They'd been used to hearing. A lot of them have worked with the Forgotten Australians project. They've been used to hearing tough stuff. They knew that it could come up in any interview at any time, and you just listen, and most times people want to tell the story and it's fine. But I think we did need additional support for people like Kath and Nicole and a couple of the other younger interviewers. We did provide training and support for the interviewers. We ran a training day where we talked through the process, and we did a lot of group workshopping and so on. All the interviewers had regular interaction with the project officer, who was based 3 or 4 days a week with me down in Melbourne. The one thing now, looking back, that I regret is that we didn't spend more time listening really closely to the first couple of interviews that each person did. We did a bit of that, but not enough, because when I now subsequently have really been listening to a lot of them, you just think, I wish I'd have said to this person, you don't have to come in as often. Let that pause go a bit longer, and so on. But, you know, lesson you learn. The most useful thing we did for our interviewers, and in one sense for the project, was create this discussion forum, which is basically, it's a Google site, it's on the website, but it's accessible only by the interviewers. And we asked all the interviewers, after you finished an interview, do a posting. Tell us about what it was like. Tell us about the place, the person, the themes that came through. Give us a document that's going to be useful for us now as we're beginning to use the material so that we can find stuff on different topics. But give us a document that'll be really useful for researchers in 200 years' time when they can read this forum posting and get something more than just what's on the recording. And so to give you an example, here's part of a discussion forum posting produced by Karen George, interviewing in South Australia. And this is just an example of the sort of thing people wrote. I recorded my interview with Jane on Monday and Tuesday this week. I drove to Kapunda each day, which was a 190-kilometre round trip, 2 days in a row. Enjoyed cruising there and back, listening to music. It was a good lead-up and wind-down from what was an intense but fascinating interview. Jane has a very detailed memory and a reflective style. She's lived a difficult life as well, and is really only now, at the age of 64, claiming her own life. We recorded for solid blocks of nearly 3 hours each day without a breather. Time seemed to fly by. I think Jane would have happily continued double that time, but I kind of needed a cuppa. Jane seems not to need food or drink. This interview is again very strong on family and growing up. Jane had a strong connection with her paternal grandmother, Bertha, who lived with them until she turned 100 when Jane was 17. It's a wonderful resource, these discussion forum postings taken together. So let me just, I'll say a few things about, I've talked about how these are very intimate stories and sometimes powerful disclosures, and clearly there are real issues about access, and because this was a project where we were aiming to put at least some of the interviews online, informed consent was very important. People had to know what was the possible use of the interview, and they had to make decisions, both in terms of what they would say onto the recording, but also on how it might be used thereafter. And people were extraordinarily frank and, for the most part, didn't close. Some people have closed interviews, and I'll talk a bit more about that at the moment. But just to give you a sense, this is Russell Elliott, who you were introduced to before. His wife died when he had 3 young kids, and he raised those 3 kids by himself, and it's an extraordinary story. But it's one of the kids went off the rails for a time, and there's just a point in the interview where Russell gives you a sense of the risk of this sort of storytelling.
Tom, interesting. Watch out, Tom, here it comes.
You better be mindful, they might listen back to this.
Yeah, that's very true, but no.
And then he proceeds to tell the story of his relationship with Tom. Now, he's obviously, to a degree, being careful. He knows that Tom's in a good place now. He's able to tell a difficult story. There's self-censorship happening to a degree. There's also decisions about what you're going to make public. Sometimes some of these stories are sharp and risky. There's stories of drug use and domestic violence, sometimes sexual abuse. Stories that might be defamatory or about illegal activity, or stories that might cause offence. And so, using a National Library website, people had to make a decision themselves, firstly whether they wanted to close an interview or make it open, and if it was open, just in the archive or online. They couldn't anonymise because the National Library's belief is that you're so identifiable from voice and place. That's not an option. And also they couldn't just take out an extract because it's too much work for an archive to deal with. So it's an all or nothing decision. You close it for 30 or 50 years, or it's open, but you can decide whether it's online or not. One thing that struck us, there's really competing ethical responsibilities. Your responsibility to the narrator and the story they want to tell, your responsibility to the other people who are talked about and who may or may not be affected by what's told, and your responsibility to history and to create a wonderful record that delves into the gutty, difficult stuff of life. And interestingly, our biggest challenges are where people want a story on the record that we fear might be either defamatory or cause great offence. The most obvious ones are around domestic violence, usually from women who've been divorced or separated or the perpetrator's died, and wants it on the record. They want that story on the record. And that's a really difficult decision. And so, and they often they tick off on the record, online, whatever. And then the archive has to then make a decision. And we've set up what we call an amber light system, where green light means we think this is fine, this interview. Red light means we think actually there's clearly something that's defamatory or illegal or deeply problematic. And amber light, we're not really sure. And we'll pass that over to Kevin Bradley at the National Library to make a decision. And they will make a decision about whether they think this is a story that the library can afford to make public, or and under what conditions. They might just keep it in the archive, they may be careful with the catalogue entry and so on. But it's it's a challenging issue. Let me move on, I guess, towards conclusion. In terms of documenting, actually, don't look at that just yet. Audio recordings without documentation are practically useless. I came across Patsy Adams-Smith's interviews with World War I veterans in the State Library of Victoria a long time ago, before they had a chance to do anything. It was a shoebox with cassettes and nothing else. Really, really hard to do anything with it. So the documentation is really important, particularly for oral history. So how are we managing and documenting a vast collection of interviews so that our own researchers and future researchers can use them effectively? And we're doing a number of things. One is we're creating time summaries. It's an alternative to a transcript. If we transcribed all the interviews, it would have almost doubled the cost of $1 million project. Time summaries are cheaper. And this is gives you an example of what it is. It's basically in blocks of time, and then you just summarise what's being talked about at that point, and you put in some keywords, and it's a searchable document. So someone can search for Bendigo or adoption or whatever, and find within an interview and across the whole collection of interviews. The disadvantage, I'm of a generation that's trained in working with text. I love a transcript because you can find your way around it easily and navigate it. I'm less good at navigating through sound. The disadvantage of the transcript is the researchers often don't listen to the interview and they don't hear all the meanings of sound. The time summary requires the researcher to listen. You find that bit, you click on it and you listen to it. Let me just show you how it works. I'll just go out of switch programs and Firefox. Okay, so these are some of interviews that from the project that are now on the National Library website. Here's David Cooper, who I did before, and it comes up, there's a catalogue entry, you do listen online, and normally you get a user agreement where you click and say yes, and I've listened to it before, so I've already clicked that one. And literally you can search, but also you can just click on any section and just play it. Might take a minute to warm up and come through. Fingers crossed it did before.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Well, I was born in Bomb Beach. My father had a war service home, so they'd just bought their first home a year before I was born, with a board house that...
You get the idea. I'll just go back to the PowerPoint. So that's the time summary, and so it means that, they'll all be on Trove, the ones that are open access. And so someone searching in Trove for a place or a topic, these interviews will come up and it'll take you straight to that little bit of an interview and you can listen to it. It's just an extraordinary resource. So that's the primary resource for accessing and using this material. But there are others. I've talked about the discussion forum, discussion forum postings that we're creating. A wonderful resource. But we've actually made a decision to close these for the moment. They're very intimate, they're very frank. They're people, we wanted our interviewers to say exactly what was going on, including, this person's memory was gone, or I really struggled with this interview, and we didn't feel like that was an appropriate thing to have on a public archive straight away. So they will go to the National Library, but they'll be closed either for 50 years, probably beyond my time. But in 100 years' time, researchers will be able to listen to the time summaries and then look at the discussion forum posting and put the two together and get a richer sense of the material. We've also asked the interviewees to give us feedback. Those are just two short examples, both in a form afterwards, but also at the end of the interview. The feedback, in the written feedback, is pretty cursory, except when they decide they've forgotten a story and they really want to tell it, and then they write it. The richest feedback about the interview is at the end of each interview. But the other thing I want to show you is something called Zotero. And this is a database that we're using as a group of historians. It's free. It was produced by a group of historians in America. It's just called Zotero. You just Google Zotero and you can find it. You can upload it. It's free. You pay a bit more if you have a lot of space, like Dropbox. And basically what we've done is brought into Zotero all the material that we've created in the project, all of our notes, our book, all our writings, everything else. But also for each interview, and I'll just show you on the next slide, each one of these ones is a folder for each of the interviewees. And within each of those folders are all the things we've created: the expression of interest, the discussion forum posting, the time summary linked to the audio so you can listen to it, the photographs, and then our notes. So I'm now taking notes and the other researchers are, and we're putting those in so we can access each other's. And everything in there is word searchable from the time summary. So if I'm looking for stuff, actually useless for me, I was doing a project about fatherhood. You put in father and you get 1 million, because people talk about their fathers all the time. Put in adoption, you can go straight to a whole load of interviews. So you have to do a bit of thoughtful searching. It's a great resource for our project. It's what we're using now to make radio and to do writing and to find extracts and find themes and work with the material. It's a way of sharing amongst a group of 9 historians a vast archive and helping each other. It's going to be something that's also going to be archived. Our final data, when we finish the project, the Zotero archive will go to the National Library as well. Kevin Bradley's working out technically how to do that at the moment. But again, we're going to close that for a time. But when it is open, it'll then be available to researchers, so they've not only got the time summaries, but they've got all this other material as well, which is also searchable. And if Kevin gets it right, it'll be a database that researchers who come into the National Library and use the material and make notes can add to the thing. So it's an organic, growing archive of people's uses of the collection. So I'm almost there. Yeah, almost there. Let me just show you what we're doing with this wonderful material. So we're making radio. I'm just going to play you one extract because I just want you to hear this because I love it. This is from this is the trailer for the pilot project.
Well, after I left school, my first job was in Coles in Smith Street, Fitzroy. That's the first Coles store, nothing over 2 and 6.
In those times, if you didn't want to continue your studies, you put in for either the bank or the public service.
And I got the letter saying, you have been appointed to Wodonga West High School. Oh my God. Could hardly be further from home.
And so at aged 18, my first ward was women's medical, and there were a couple of old men in the single rooms, and I'd never seen a naked man.
Didn't really know much about my Aboriginality spiritual stuff, and it's taken me a long time to work that out.
Yeah, I've got 4 children, and there's a couple I'd like to parent again to do it differently.
I'll leave it at that, it goes on. The thing I just want you to think about with that is just the voice. One of the lovely things the radio people have been doing is when they create montages around a particular theme like education or giving birth or whatever, they don't usually identify this as a person born such and such a time and place, but you can hear it, you can work it out as an audience. You're listening and thinking, okay, that's probably a Queenslander and probably born in the 30s or 40s, and that's just lovely because the voice is so rich and so powerful and so meaningful. The last thing we're doing is the writing. One I won't talk about, which is a theme issue of a journal where all the academics are writing academic stuff about what we've learnt with this material. But the other thing we're doing, which is really fun and really exciting and a bit scary and new, is we're creating a book, an anthology, which will include a set of life stories and then a set of themes with material from all the interviews. And it's going to be a paperback and an ebook. But the ebook, every time there's an extract from an interview, you'll be able to click on it and go straight and hear it. And I'm just going to show you, I'll just show you, the National Library's just done this with the Forgotten Australian. I'm going to get out of here so I can go straight to it. Forgotten Australian project, I don't want a software update.
The next one.
Sorry, don't want him. I think I've lost it. Next one, sorry, there it is. So the Forgotten Australians project about people who are in care. This is the final publication, and if you scroll through it, you get extracts all the way through, and you just click on each of them. And it takes a while. It takes you to the extract, and in a second it plays it. So that's the sort of thing you can start to do.
It was so regimented. We could have been in the army. Get up at 6.
So I'm
Be
gonna stop
on
it.
your job by half
Oh,
past.
I can never know how to stop.
Be
Where
back
am I?
at 10 to 7 to make
Where's my
your
stop?
bed. And
There.
at 7.
Okay. Look, I'm going to stop there. I had some concluding comments, but you've got enough from me to get a sense of this material, of the technical and historical challenges we faced, the richness of the material and the possibilities that are presented by both new technologies on the one hand and the old technology of people telling you their story in extraordinary richness, depth and detail. It's a lovely thing to be able to do, to sit behind a machine and ask someone to tell me your story. Thank you.
So many possibilities and such fantastic insight into how to go about such a big project, but all of them at multiple outcomes. And wouldn't it be fantastic? We all create a book like they're really pushing the idea of a format of the oral histories and linking the book and the oral history in an integrated package. So there's a couple of things. There's afternoon tea on the terrace for everyone to continue talking and sharing and some hospitality. But probably let's just make time for 1 or 2 questions or comments. I know we've got lots of very experienced oral of historian broadcasters, like people who look after collections. Does anyone have a question, comment?
This is probably a really boring question. But Alistair, you had 3 outcomes, which was the archive, the writing and the radio. So just to clarify, people who willingly participated signed consent forms that probably they agreed to the broadcasting of the material. And so the radio was able to initially use some content and has done that. But now the National Library has closed the collection.
No.
Okay, can you clarify that?
Basically, the consent form, they could tick the first box, which was yes, happy for it to be in the library, online, used by anyone, anywhere, forever. Or they could then go through, if they tick no to that, they go through and work out very specific conditions about use in the archive, use by others like radio, and then actually specific stuff for our project. So there were people who decided to close their interview because they wanted to be anonymised and they didn't want it to be online or even in the archive, but they agreed that our project could use it as long as it wasn't identifiable. We didn't use those on radio because it was too easily identifiable. With the writing we might.
An important part of that process was the opportunity to hear it. So they gave it, you recorded it, you gave it back to them, they heard it, and then they made a decision?
No. With a project of this scale, we gave everybody a copy, an audio copy of the interview after the fact, not straight away. On the whole, we asked people, they had all the information in advance, you talk about it before the interview, you talk about it at the end of the interview, and then you work through the form and they decide what they do. Yeah. They can change their mind, so when they get it later, if they decide, actually, I've made a mistake, I'm worried about who's going to hear this, they can change their conditions at any point. But no, we didn't wait until they'd listened to it, partly because most people don't listen to 5 hours. No. Reading a transcript and approving it is different from trying to approve the spoken thing. So usually people had to know when they spoke what the possibilities were, and then they had to make an informed decision at the end of the interview what they wanted to do with it. And I haven't got the stats here, but we've just done it. But a very large proportion, over 3/4, said yes, online, open slather. A very small proportion closed for 30, 50 years, and then a few in between. But most of the material is available pretty much now. All of it will be available in 100 years' time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hello,
Hi.
My name is Georgine. I'm a lay person, but very interested in oral histories, especially our local history here in South Brisbane, because I'm a second-generation Greek. What I suppose we'd like to know is the training involved in actually performing or doing an interview. As you said, there are some very horrible ones around, and I've seen lots of those, and so we'd like to do it very well. So are there some guidelines or some fact sheets or something of the questions and how to ask and how to approach that has worked very well, obviously, for you, not wanting to reinvent the wheel? Is there something you can share?
Yeah, there's several things. Beth Robertson produced an oral history handbook for the Oral History Association. It's now in the 5th edition. That's available if you go to the Oral History Association website. You can order it through that. So that's a handbook, but nothing beats decent training with experienced interviewers. I'm pretty sure the Queensland branch, I know that the Victorian branch runs workshops regularly, training workshops. I'd just urge people to do that before you do anything, while it's going down. I mean, you know, a day workshop's probably a bare minimum. I spent a year working with students, and at the end of the year they still think they don't know how to do it. Because the more you do it, the more, I mean, and, you know, I've done a lot of interviews over a lot of years, and you're only as good as your next interview, and you turn up on the doorstep and you don't know who they're going to be or what it's going to be like and how it's going to work, and you're nervous and you're anxious, and then you just take a deep breath and you've learned a few lessons. Most of all, you've learned to sit quiet and listen. You've hopefully got confident with the equipment, so you're not spending all your time worrying about that, and mostly you're focusing on them. And that's a human skill, but it's a human skill that can be improved.
Is that turned? Yeah. To a previous question, you responded, it'll all be available to us in 100 years. And that's my question. What confidence, in what format are you holding this material? And what confidence do you have it'll be available in 10 years, let alone? Because you previously answered about the shoebox full of tapes.
Yeah.
Well, I have several shoeboxes full of tapes that not only cannot get a machine to do it, but their tapes are all stretched.
Yeah.
So.
My confidence is you work with the best. So you work with a state library or a regional record office, or in our case a national library, where they've got the technical skills and capacities that I'll never have. And so I know that the team at the National Library are dedicated to upgrading their material as softwares and hardwares change. So, you know, they digitise all their cassettes, and once they're in a digital format, they make sure they're in a digital format that they're reasonably certain will be able to be, what's the word? There's a fancy technical word for it. You're all archivists, librarians. What's the word when you move something to a new... Migrate to the next platform. So, but, you know, none of us with our shoeboxes of interviews can do that. So you need to really partner with an archive that has the resources and the skills to both preserve and migrate up across time. Because you really do want these things to be available in 500 years' time, and we can't imagine the technologies of that far ahead. So we just do the best we can. So you don't do recordings on tinny little, you know, dictaphones on horrible software. You do them as uncompressed WAV files on decent machines, so it's good audio, and so it is of a type that can be migrated up for the future. Big issue.
Enormous issue.
It's why we need to persuade our governments that archives and libraries are really, really important.
Well, what a great note. So people could please thank Alistair again. And
Thank you.